Yeah, that's right. I've also found, like in my much shorter time selling than yours, Andy, that people they're not coming to those calls expecting you to know everything. What they're coming is they're curious about the work we're doing with other organizations. They want to know what other people are doing, and they're really happy to go on and talk about themselves when they're asked the kinds of questions that bring them deeper into the insights about what their challenges are. I think part of my own fear of going into those calls came from having my start in academia, where there was just like a very high bar about showing up as expert all the time. And so it hadn't occurred to me that people were so much more chilled out in other aspects of the working world. So that was a revelation. But yeah, people who are interested in talking to you in the first place want to know, what successes we've had, but they want a thinking partner to work through what the challenge is and to get to a solution. They're not necessarily looking for you to give advice or to solve problems. They know what we sell. They know we're not going to do that.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Shannon Minifie. Shannon's the CEO at Box of Crayons, which is a learning and development company based in Toronto that creates and delivers practical learning experiences that unleash the power of curiosity to create connected and engaged company cultures. Now, in this conversation for the archives of the Sales Enablement Podcast, Shannon and I are talking about one of my favorite subjects, curiosity. I mean, curiosity is at the heart of what I write about in my latest book, Sell Without Selling Out. And Shannon's firm, Box of Crayons, last year published a really interesting paper titled From Troublemaker to Changemaker: How to Harness Curiosity to Build Resilience and Innovation. So we start talking about this by digging into why curious people, those who challenge assumptions and want to know the why behind the how, why these people are often considered troublemakers. And we dive into why giving advice and making assumptions are killing your company and your sales team, and why, if your organization is more advice-driven than curiosity-led, you are missing valuable opportunities to be more innovative, resilient, and successful, these are all traits that successful sales teams need to have. We also explore the 7 business outcomes that are triggered by curiosity and how these apply specifically to sales leaders and salespeople. So we get into all this and much, much more. But before we get to Shannon, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could leave us a review or a rating. Give us your feedback about how we're doing. We really appreciate it. All right, let's jump into it. Shannon, welcome to the show.
Andy, thanks for having me.
A pleasure to have you here. And as we were talking before we started recording, we'd sort of lined you up to come on the show, and then in the midst of COVID, you had a child.
I did.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so that all went okay? You were able to have family with you and so on when you delivered?
Yeah, my husband was able to be with me when I delivered, and because of when my son was born, numbers were low enough that actually some of my family was able to actually meet him before going back into stay-at-home orders and all of the fun stuff that the winter season brought. So we had it was a little blessing, the window of time in which he was born, for sure.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I got to think about it. That's got to be strange. A baby's growing up the first year, everybody they see has a mask on.
Yeah. And babies respond so much to faces.
Yeah,
he's definitely, he's less comfortable around new people and new faces than my other son is, because he's just not known very many faces in his short life. He's 11 months now, and he knows the faces of about 5 people. So that's heartbreaking for my mom. But he'll get used to her.
Well, I was just thinking that in the context of, we sort of relocated our base of operations from New York to San Diego during COVID. It had been planned in advance. It just happened to happen during COVID. And I was getting all new doctors and so on. And I've got a handful of doctors now that I've been seeing for a year and a half.
I couldn't recognize them on the street if I ran into them because every time we
Right.
see them, they have masks. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a strange world.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it will become less strange. Hey, yeah, no, actually, I hadn't thought about that in the context of what we're going to talk about because, we've had your colleague, Michael Bungay-Stanier, on the show, I don't know, 3 times, I think, maybe. And I was thinking, gosh, now we get the person on the show who does all the work. So
No, that's not true. There's a whole team of us up here that does all the work.
I know, I was just kidding. I was just giving him a hard time. So
Yeah.
tell us about Box of Crayons and the work you guys do.
Yeah. So we're a learning and development company that helps organizations transform from being advice-driven to curiosity-led. And what that means is that organizations come to us when they have identified a need for their people, for their culture, to be more driven by a desire to be open to learning, to supporting each other in discovery, to reducing conflict by considering other perspectives, to be able to develop their people by creating space for their people to articulate and wrestle with their challenges and take accountability for the challenges that they identify. So when those are some of the sort of behavioral pain points that clients come to us with, and then they partner with us and we design and deliver programs that help individuals shift their behaviors around being more curiosity-led. And then that in turn helps transform the way the organization relates to one another and how they approach innovation and communication and development of their people.
So when I was reading this white paper that you've written called From Troublemaker to Changemaker, How to Harness Curiosity to Build Resilience and Innovation. And as I was going through that, and you talk about my transforming from advice-led to curiosity-led, I mean, that's one of the real problems that exists in many sales organizations is that there's a dearth of curiosity about the people they're selling to.
Yeah.
Have you worked specifically with sales organizations?
We have worked specifically with sales organizations, and you're absolutely right. That is the dearth that a couple of our clients have brought to us, looking for us to help remedy.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll get into this because it's sort of, I think, what's happened over the span of several decades that I've experienced firsthand is that, yeah, we've migrated to a time where we're sort of trying to squelch curiosity. The curious do seem to be troublemakers, those that question things. And I just wondering, sort of background, why do we think that's happened? When we've had all this disruption in technology and seemingly giving people more freedom and more tools to be curious, we seem to be less curious. And Tom Nichols had written about this in The Death of Expertise. Is we just become suspicious of it, and we seem to have our minds made up more.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Ian Leslie, I think it was, in his writing about curiosity, lands on a similar conclusion as well, which is that sort of in the age of just Googling the answer to anything, the amount of time we sit contemplating a mystery or like sitting in deep thinking and investigation of something has been reduced dramatically. And he makes this good point that, anything is Googleable to find the answer, but the thing that Google can't tell you is what question to ask. Mm-hmm. And so part of what you're doing when you're being curious, when you're sort of following that desire to know something, is you're discovering what the better question is that gets you to that next level of understanding.
Right.
The trouble we said about the troublemaker tendency is, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it exactly how you, we'd thought about it, but hadn't articulated it in exactly the same way in the white paper. This idea that you don't want people asking too many questions. But I think that's right. I mean, it can feel disruptive. We've decided on this thing, we're moving forward. I have the accountability for this decision I've made. And so what's the purpose of asking other people what they think, or being open to,
Right,
to
just
that.
shut up
It's
and go
just going to
along.
slow things down. And I'll share really candidly with you that I really recently fell prey to that myself. So, and one of my colleagues here at Box of Crayons, Chantel Thorne, who's our director of program development, sent me a really good note. She's an expert in organizational change. And our challenge that we had is just we were changing a simple policy around how we work with some of our key resources. And it was a good decision to make. The decision makes all the sense for the business. And I and some of my colleagues working on the communication of that change underestimated what that change would mean to the people on the other side. And what mattered in the end more was how the change was communicated, which is to say, without pausing to be curious longer about how that would land for other people. And, Chantel has since come forward and said, hey, let me help out with this. I've got a couple of points along the way where asking some more questions and involving more people in the leadership of that change would have made a huge difference. I definitely hear that around, as soon as I open the field to people to ask questions, it's going to delay what we want to get done. And there's a sense it slows things down. The other thing we identified in the white paper was just that curiosity is typically viewed in a more limited scope around, not just a desire to know something, but sort of the curiosity killed the cat kind of desire. So I want to, get into something. It's like mischief driven. And so, not a lot of senior leaders maybe want people to think that they want to have their people spend their time being curious like that. And that's why it was really important for us to re-articulate that for us, rather than curiosity being simply a desire to know something, we want the folks we work with, the organizations we work with, to recognize change maker curiosity as a behavior. And so that be curious, when we say be curious, in many ways, that's an imperative to be present for other people and to the parts of your own thinking that you haven't noticed or you may want to deny. So it's not just a desire to know something. It's really relationship based, and it's about openness and vulnerability. It's a behavior.
Well, I think, I spin curiosity a little bit differently.
Great.
I think it's, to me, and not necessarily to the rest of the world, curiosity is the desire to understand something.
Nice.
And you'd use the word no, and I'm not picking on that, but I think this is the issue that I see and have talked about it a lot here, and actually writing about it in my new book is we stop at knowing. We stop gathering information. We can Google something. We can learn a fact. But I think to the point that you brought before is we then don't take it a step further to make sure we really understand it.
Right.
And I think this is, and you address this in the white paper, and I think this is a problem I see. Certainly I'll talk from the sales perspective, is we arm our sellers, we enable our sellers with playbooks and questions to ask and so on, but we don't train them to go further, right? They take things at face value, as opposed to continuing to ask questions. So we have this, what I call a gap, between knowing and understanding.
Yeah.
And you bridge that with curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've been thinking a lot. I've got my own sort of agenda here today, Andy, because I'm curious. We've been thinking a lot about client centricity as an organization and what client centricity means for Box of Crayons, and it's something I've been thinking about. And I've been thinking about the way in which curiosity is it's a way of being other directed, because you're placing the client need, understanding the client need at the center, rather than your own sort of product that you're selling at the center. And so it's a powerful form of client centricity. So I like the way that you just phrased that there's something sort of cursory about just thinking, okay, I heard that, so I know it, as opposed to the time and the question asking and the exploration it takes to more deeply understand something.
Well, and aligns right with what you had just said is that, again, one of the things I address in my new book is, and this is not an issue just purely of modern sellers, this has been one forever, is that, we train sellers to go out and pitch a product, right? Mm-hmm. So your job nominally is go sell a product. Mm-hmm. But is that really your job? Because what you're doing is you may know certain things about the customer, but you're basically self-centered at that point, mm-hmm. right? Because I'm just trying to sell my product, right. As opposed to making sure I really understand what are the most important things to the buyer, right? In terms of challenges they have, or most important things in terms of the outcomes they want to achieve. And when I understand those, then my ability to work with them is other-centric to help them come to, hopefully it'll be the best conclusion for them. Yeah, that's enhanced. Whereas if I'm just saying, yeah, I know what you need, and here it is.
Yeah.
Then it's completely different. There's no curiosity involved in that at all.
Right. And you feel that when you're on the other side of that. Absolutely.
Oh, sure.
Right. Because I know you have a book coming out soon with Page Two. I think Phil Jones is another Page Two author. Yes. In his book, Exactly What to Say, I think it was, he talks about, yes. He describes sales as being about earning the right to make a recommendation. I think Phil said that. Maybe you would know the source. Maybe it's somebody else. But earning the right to make a recommendation. And so it really is about relationship and trust, but also demonstrated understanding that you've grasped what the real challenge is. And that can't be done through some cursory playbook questions that you ask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm wondering at sort of a corporate level, mm-hmm. And you say, quoting from the paper, you write that companies invest in other forms of learning and development, but really not investing in developing curiosity. And so sort of interest is, how do you do that? How do you develop, the the curious gene, if you will, within individuals, or increase their CQ, as one researcher applied to it?
Yeah. So one of the sort of stances that we're taking around this is that, like a lot of the curiosity research centers around this debate about whether curiosity is a state or a trait in individuals. So I'm it's either a trait I have or it's a state I'm in. And I think that one of the insights that Francesca Gino and others who are mm-hmm. working in particular on the application of or the impacts rather of curiosity in organizations in particular, rather than in education or just in society. One of the insights there is that by creating an environment, so in other words, a larger organizational state in which curiosity is cultivated and will thrive, your organization will get better results. So what I mean when we say organizations invest in other kinds of learning and development is that, people can say, I think it's on its face, it seems hard to argue that curiosity is good for your business. But when you look down underneath the hood and you look at and you review the literature, it's really easy actually to see that organizations that are able to have more curiosity-led people in them innovate faster because they support learning and they support the failure that comes with experimentation. They work better together because they have strong connections that come from empathetic openness and psychological safety that people have together, which also leads mm-hmm. to less conflict. Mm-hmm. They're more engaged because they bring more ideas, and so they work harder, which leads to more better results and back to innovation. And they're more resilient. So the people in them are more resilient as individuals, but so is the organization, better able to evolve and pivot. So again, back to innovation. So the way that we work with organizations starts really at that individual level. So our programs are all about how do we help people recognize that their advice monster, which is this key, and I know you know all about the advice monster because you said Michael's been on the show 3 times.
Right. We've talked about this. Yes.
Yeah. So the content of Michael's coaching habit book is the bulk of the content at the center of the programs that we design and deliver. And what we're trying to do is counter really 2 beliefs in individuals. So the 2 beliefs we encounter are that the belief that my advice is helpful and we don't think it usually is. And secondly, the belief that it's my job to give advice and provide answers.
Right.
So most of the folks in our programs would think their advice is helpful and they'd think it's their job to give advice. And thinking back about the organizational state, we can and we do in our programs help them to see that creating space to help others realize what their challenges are and asking the right questions to drive them understanding those challenges is actually more helpful than giving advice. And that their job to develop people is to create that space and ask those questions rather to give advice. So to empower people. But often folks in organizations will be up against an internal culture that says on the one hand, yeah, it's your job to develop people and, let them try and fail and ask questions and, do all that stuff. And then on the other hand, there is an actual expectation that leaders demonstrate that they have all the answers on a regular basis. So sometimes there's that tension sort of between what the organization
exists all the time. Yeah.
Says about themselves and what the organization actually is.
Right. And the hard thing for leaders, because again, we talk about a lot on the show, is we don't, within sales generally, leaders, frontline managers aren't enabled with the tools and the training they need to even do sort of the basics of what you just talked about, which is instead of defaulting, and so that's why they default to advice giving and conformity, let's say, because that's easier, right? I mean, they've on one hand they haven't been taught, let's say a methodology like Michael's for coaching, which helps people identify what their challenges are and identify how to solve it. Instead, that's like, we've got a number to hit. Do this, do that. And what we see is that in the sales landscape, sort of increasing amounts of emphasis on conformity and compliance to process,
right,
rather than let people experiment. And as you quote in the paper from Professor Gino, I think the quote was, companies say they treasure inquisitive minds. In fact, most stifle curiosity, fearing it will increase risk and inefficiency.
Yeah.
But I think there's another thing, is leaders just don't want to be questioned. Right?
Yeah.
I think there's an element of power in there as well, which is to me is very destructive.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that part of curiosity, when I talk about it as an imperative to be present to your own thinking and your own behavior that you might want to deny, to sort of sit in, why am I responding that way? It's it's a call for leaders and for everyone to be curious, like, what is it that I'm doing when I'm doing what I'm doing? To quote another of my colleagues' family members who says that a lot. It's a great saying. How do you sit there and wonder what's motivating you, what biases, what fears? I mean, this is the kind of thing I think Michael got into in the last conversation with you about, what is that DNA behind my advice monster that fears that I can't show that I'm as good or better than other people. It's like, I promise, like, the programs aren't this dark. We're known for having really fun, programs, but you need kind of there has to be something at stake there. And I think you've nailed what's at stake, Andy, right? Which is like, that's hard for leaders because there's these dark aspects of power. That
giving up
show
control.
Up. Yeah.
I mean, again, there's another article from Francesca Gino that was in the Harvard Business Review a few years ago about let your workers rebel, and writing about the need for companies to encourage constructive nonconformity. To give people more autonomy and agency to be curious, to experiment in order to improve. Whereas, as you talk about and point out in the paper, is that curiosity and the autonomy are viewed with suspicion oftentimes. Yeah,
or like it's separated out from the regular way that people do their job. Like, part of what we're trying to cultivate in people is the ability for curiosity to be a habit, so that when I'm being coach-like and curious. It's not dedicated to a 1 hour conversation, and I'm going to show up that way and ask questions. And I'm going to spend the whole rest of my 7 or 8 hours of my day being a different way. What we're trying to do is have people make curiosity a habit so that every opportunity, every interaction is an opportunity to be more coach-like. So I think that what some of those organizations do when they're well-meaning, with things like the 20% time and things like that. So, you can spend 1 day a week dreaming or doing the quote unquote creative or curious work. It separates it from all of the other opportunities, and interactions all day long to be curious. It's not, curiosity isn't something you're just over here doing 20% of the time.
No.
Being coach-like isn't something you're over here doing 20% of the time, especially, we're talking about, if we want to talk about sales in particular. We worked with a big research and advisory firm years ago that had identified a huge client retention problem. And when our client when our buyer who ended up hiring us, looked into that, he went around and he looked at the advisors who had high client retention and dug into, what is it about the way that you run those advisory calls? What are you doing? And he discovered that they had the ability to be more coach-like. They were more thinking partners to their clients than the other people were. So he helped to identify what I need is to scale and operationalize curiosity as a behavior in this firm. And so we went in and we trained all of those advisors to approach those calls really, really asking the questions that help them dig down and understand what the real challenge is and create that space for their client to, come to a realization or ask another question that they hadn't asked before. And when they weren't doing that, they were jumping to advice and solutions before they'd identified what the real problem was. And they saw a huge rise in retention from the kind of mid 70 level to 80% and above. So it was great.
Yeah, I mean, and you raised an interesting point, which is that if you're a sales manager and you're listening to the show and you listen to this episode, is from a mindset perspective, are you approaching coaching calls or coaching sessions with people that work for you from a position of curiosity or, as you said, a position of advice?
Right.
And polar opposites, like opposite ends of the spectrum from each other. I mean, similar if you're dealing with your clients, your existing clients, and you have retention issues. Are you coming in and advising them on how to better use your product to get more out of it? Or are you leading with your curiosity to find out what are the challenges and the blockers to increase usage of your product that then can stimulate a conversation? And it's that, you call it a state. I sort of call it a mindset. It's where do you sit between being curious and incurious? Yeah. And we're never perfect, 100% curious, but you do want to strive to be more that direction.
Yeah. I mean, I think definitely the organizations we work with who are attempting big strategic culture change are trying to change the state of their organization so that it can support curious behaviors. But I agree with you, in individuals, it's a mindset shift that supports a shift in behavior. Yeah.
And you talked about psychological safety before. Is certainly there are organizations where they don't encourage questioning. And I write about in my book is I was fortunate, I guess, to work for bosses that tolerated me because I question everything. That's just what I've always done. I'd like to say, maybe it's because I was, child of the 60s or something where, question authority was the watchword.
Right.
But I've always sort of approached it that way, is that, I could ask somebody a question and I could get an answer. And to me, my first response is, well, there's got to be more here. As opposed to just taking it face value. And so I wanted to sort of follow up with that, is talk about, in the paper, you talk about sort of 7 business outcomes that curiosity unleashes. And the first one was introspective intelligence, which, based on intellectual humility. And I think this is really one of the keys in my mind of curiosity is just this willingness to admit that you don't know everything.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's hard for some people.
Yeah, it's hard for me. It's hard for all people, I think, Andy.
Well, yeah, we want to be considered, I guess, as experts, but it's if you want to keep learning, is you have to have that intellectual humility and self-awareness to have it, to say, yeah, there's something I don't understand here.
Right. Yeah. And as a leader, it's particularly difficult because you want to strike the balance between having that humility and using the resources around you, like all the brilliant people around you. It's not about you having the answers. It's about you supporting and empowering other people, but always feeling like you have to strike the balance between that and the sense that you're leading as well, somehow.
Yeah.
In your own thinking.
Well, but I think even as an individual salesperson, you're in a leadership position with your buyers.
Yes.
And the intellectual humility goes a long ways in demonstrating that, because you compare that with pretending that, or feeling like you need to pretend that you have all the answers, is a default mode for a lot of salespeople, because they're afraid that they'll be shown to be less than in the eyes of the buyers if they don't have answers to questions. And yeah, I've rarely felt that in my career. Always, because I start off being lucky in the people I was calling on entrepreneurs that built good-sized businesses who were the CEOs of these companies, and just being curious, just keep asking questions, and as long as it looked like I was sincere in my effort to gain information, gain understanding, they would spend as much time with me almost as I wanted.
Yeah.
And help me get smarter about their business. And so I think as a salesperson in particular, but in general, just in your career, is people say there's no such thing as a dumb question, but I mean, along that line is if you ask sincere, interesting questions, people won't care that you don't have the answers. What they care about is that you're trying to get the answer.
Right. Absolutely. And people love engaging with curious people. Like you walk away from people who have asked you genuine, authentic questions that you can tell are motivated by a desire to understand. You walk away with just this solid sense of just how centered you were for them in that interaction. Like they're not thinking about themselves at all when they're being really curious about you. It's a thinking about relationship in selling. It's a great way for your client to leave the interaction. If every interaction is a chance for you to build trust and build relationship, it's a great way for them to leave that interaction, to feel just how invested you are in understanding what's going on for them, and to really pinpoint the challenges.
Right. And you would then also make yourself more interesting to them by being interested in what they're interested in.
Yep.
And you say another one of the business outcomes is empathetic openness. And how, this ability to be open to somebody else and to receive their answers without judgment, listen without judgment.
Yeah.
I like the phrase you use is, curiosity slows down the rush to judgment.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's an interesting state, you say necessarily in terms of, instead of a trait, is, being in the moment, being present, listening to understand, but then, building a pause in so your curiosity can be deployed. Yeah.
It's also where I think curiosity has the ability to, like in terms of curiosity having the ability to increase your capacity for empathy, it's where that aspect of curiosity is not just about, like you put it really well, Andy, not a desire to know something, but to understand something. So I think in that empathetic openness, you are really relinquishing the desire to, line up your perception of something with someone else's perception, to validate theirs against yours. So, it's that openness of, okay, that perspective or that perception is right because it's yours. And so curiosity becomes a sort of antidote to bias, to assumptions I might make about what motivates other people's thinking and behavior. It's a way of reminding yourself just how embedded you are in your own perception and experience, and how subjective that really is.
Yeah. Oh, and you talk about empathy in particular, right? Because the way empathy is presented to most sellers when they're being trained and so on is it's putting yourself in another person's shoes. It's like, okay, but there's an assumption that you understand what it's like to be in their shoes.
Yeah.
And for me, empathy is more about deploying your curiosity to understand not how someone feels, but understand why they feel the way they do. Because when you have that why, then you have the ability to understand, okay, what's the challenges they face and what are the potential outcomes that would be beneficial to them.
Yeah. Yep, that's right.
So that why becomes very important, sort of the cognitive empathy thing.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, and we talked about meaningful connections was one of the outcomes you talked about. We just sort of touched on that. So spend a second talk about psychological safety, because this is oftentimes used as, I don't say it's looked down on. Let's say people sort of hear that term and think, oh, coddling people.
Yeah, I think it's one of those terms that's been so overused. It almost doesn't mean anything anymore.
Right, but it has a specific use here, and why don't you explain that, because it's not about coddling.
No, it's not about coddling. So when I am thinking about or using the term psychological safety, I mean really specifically, I think it's Amy Edmondson's, I think she kind of owns the definition here. It's certainly her work. It is the belief that I can share opinions and ideas and not be, persecuted for doing that.
Right.
So that is, I do hear the term psychological safety used in a lot looser and different ways to mean in general how
protecting people from failure.
Yeah, protecting people from failure, or people at work don't like me. I don't feel psychologically safe. Mm-hmm. Or my colleague thought my presentation sucked. I'm not psychologically safe, and it's not. Mm-hmm. It kind of erodes the real insight here, which is, have you created an organization in which people can share an idea that might be contrary to their leaders or their colleagues' idea, and there won't be punitive action because of that?
Right.
Yeah. So is it safe for them to do that? And so when we talk about meaningful connections, what we're talking about here is that because people have part of the model when we're looking at this is the way in which these individual behaviors create capabilities for teams working together, which then lead to the organizational results, like resilience and innovation. So looking at psychological safety, for sure, if you have folks that are connecting over sharing ideas, disagreeing, but knowing it's safe to disagree, because people counter and meet those differing perspectives with openness to those other perspectives, and that creates a culture in which people feel psychologically safe to contribute ideas that might at first blush be unpopular or be contrary to the prevailing opinion or to the decision that has basically been made.
Yeah, well, we work in environments that are inherently more collaborative these days.
Yeah.
And I just had interviewed Ann Latham for the show. Had written a book called Uncommon Clarity, and I love what she read. I don't know if it was her term or she just used it in the book, but redefined knowledge workers as interaction workers, right? Because so much of our job is involved in interacting with other people, working through other people to get our job done.
Yeah.
And it's, why some people think collaboration is one of the top work skills that people need to have these days. But yes, this is a sales show. We bring it back to sales. Is selling to a buyer is sort of the ultimate form of collaboration, both with your team internally, working with the buyer and the stakeholders on that side.
Yeah, Absolutely it is, right? Like you're trying to understand on their side, who are all the people who need to be involved in the decision? Like first, who are all the people who have a stake in solving this problem? How do they view the problem? How does this challenge show up for them? Who are all the decision makers involved in the decision to engage and buy your product, buy your program? And
Right.
and then yes, as that point of contact and of escalation as the key account manager, how do you bring all the people in the organization around you to service the client who has managed to collaborate with you and with all the folks on their side to make that decision?
Well, and it's a matter of sort of perspective, I think, with the fact that you're working with someone as opposed to, I always say sales is something you do with a buyer, not something you do to them, because we always talk about selling to somebody.
Yes.
We need like another verb,
We do.
maybe other than selling.
Yeah.
'Cause this is clearly something we do with the buyer, but that's not going to go very far if you're not creating environments where people can collaborate.
Right.
And so as a seller, you have to do that. You have to think about what is the environment you're creating, the experience you're creating for the buyer.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you pointed out, like, we need a different word for that. I definitely came into, so I started with working at Box of Crayons almost 6 years ago. And when I came on, I was working very part-time doing book promotion. And at that time Box of Crayons needed its first salesperson. And Michael, our founder and then CEO, asked if I was interested in being a salesperson. And I was like, okay, sure. But I was doing it very part-time, and I was doing my doctorate in English literature. So I had this whole idea of kind of death of a salesman. I just had a very narrow sense of what selling was. And so did the test that I went through to see what my capacity was for being a salesperson. I came at it on the other side of like DISC and all of these other kinds of things, saying, oh, okay, Shannon's interested in like aesthetics and values and not that money driven. Probably actually she shouldn't be a salesperson in the sort of crude way that you think about sales. But what I realized once I started selling right away was, first of all, that selling Thoreau to 18-year-olds is way harder than selling great coaching programs to leaders in HR and learning and development who really care about their people.
That's probably true.
It was totally true. But also that when I was teaching literature, what I was trying to do was have the student connect with an idea. I wasn't trying to sell them my point of view on a piece of work. I was trying to figure out, how do you connect to this idea or to some of the ideas in this text? And it's a way more, it's not exactly what's happening when in a sales conversation, but it is much more collaborative like that, like you're saying. It's like, what do you see of yourself and your challenge in what we have to offer? And, what can our organization do to support the need that you've expressed on the other side? And like, where do we meet across that idea? We have this idea at Box of Crayons about what curiosity can do for your organization, and how do we find a way to meet there if meeting there makes sense for us?
Well, last point I want to cover is, and you had alluded to it earlier, you talk about change maker curiosity. So explain what change maker curiosity is.
Change maker curiosity is, for us, again, it's a stance toward what is unknown that is open and vulnerable. So instead of thinking about curiosity in this sort of troublemaker way of mischief making, I just need to go and discover this thing. I need to break this rule just because I was told not to. I need to see what's on the other side of that door. With changemaker curiosity, it's really about a behavior toward what is unknown.
Right.
So how do I, and that thing that's unknown might be a problem. It might be a situation. It could be another person. And by approaching the mystery of that with wonder and with curiosity, rather than with fear or with the desire for control that usually comes with encountering the unknown, you create space for other people and other perspectives, and you're more likely to learn as well.
and that applies so deeply to sales, right? Because
Yeah.
if you're listening to the show and you're in sale, you're a seller, individual contributors, what Shannon just said is when you're approaching I'm sort of extrapolating from what you said is you approach every new opportunity as a mystery.
Yep.
And this, as opposed to, wow, this customer fits in a box and they're just like these other customers I've dealt with. Therefore, they're going to have these requirements. And when I ask these questions, these are the answers I'm going to hear. And I'm not really going to go much deeper than that because they look just like everybody else.
Yeah, that's right.
But instead if you approach from the point of, well, yeah, there might be some similarities, but they're all unique. There is this mystery about it. I mean, this is what kept me in sales and has kept me in sales for 4 decades, is this every situation is unique.
Yeah.
That's the fun part.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I mentioned earlier that we've been thinking about client centricity and what that means for us at Box of Crayons. And I've been reading pretty widely on the topic and read recently Peter Fader of Wharton. So yeah, I figured you'd be familiar. And
he was on the show about a year ago. Yeah.
Okay, I need to go back and listen to his. I've now read his book, books plural. But he talks about something you just said, which is that you have first misunderstanding is that you have an ideal customer. There are customers plural, and they are different and they are unique. But that's not a small thing, right? Like every bit of sales training is about mapping out your ideal client, right?
Yeah.
Where does she shop? What's her political spectrum? Like it's very limiting. And so to just right off the bat say, you know what, you have customers plural. There is not a customer that looks the same, is a huge insight. And I think we know it deep down, but then is that showing up in our practices and our training and the way that we think about, how we sell. And I love also, I was listening to the Curious Advantage podcast with Simon Brown, and I always forget the other two names of the other two hosts. But I think it was their very first podcast or episode. They had a Spanish academic on talking about the ability for curiosity, or for approaching things from a curious mindset to totally dispel fear. And I think about early sales calls I was on where I was nervous, right? Like, there's like 5 people on the other side and I'm like, oh God, who are these people? And she had this very strong research that if you go into something just from the perspective of I am just here to learn and ask questions and be curious, even just kind of like, repeating that as a mantra and making that your mindset, you can like feel yourself become less anxious and less nervous. And then you perform better, you ask better questions, you show up truly more curious, all the good things we just talked about for an hour.
Well, I think the fear in sales, oftentimes when you're a salesperson, you're making a call on a new customer, either in person, video, what have you. I think the fear is, again, I referred to it earlier, is that you're going to be discovered as being less than, right?
Yes.
That you're not going to be able to answer the question. They're going to think you're dumb. They're going to think you're stupid. And which, first of all, they don't. And if you approach from the position as like, hey, I'm there to learn, I'm there to ask questions, I'm there to be of service to them.
Yes.
Then the fear really dissipates, as she said in her research, because you don't have your ego at stake anymore.
Yeah, that's right. I've also found, like in my much shorter time selling than yours, Andy, that people they're not coming to those calls expecting you to know everything.
No,
what they're coming is they're curious about the work we're doing with other organizations. They want to know what other people are doing, and they're really happy to go on and talk about themselves when they're asked the kinds of questions that bring them deeper into the insights about what their challenges are. I think part of my own fear of going into those calls came from having my start in academia, where there was just like a very high bar about showing up as expert all the time. And so it hadn't occurred to me that people were so much more chilled out in other aspects of the working world. So that was a revelation. But yeah, like people who are interested in talking to you in the first place want to know, what successes we've had, but they want a thinking partner to work through what the challenge is and to get to a solution. They're not necessarily looking for you to give advice or to solve problems. They know what we sell. They know we're not going to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the bottom line, my belief is that for every sales interaction you have with a potential buyer is what they want as a result of the meeting they have with you, the interaction they have with you, is at the end of it to be some degree closer to being able to make their decision than they were before you got there.
That's right.
And that oftentimes, in fact, I would say in my experience and in my sales career, the vast majority of the time, they've been moved forward by the questions I ask more so than any fact that I've stated.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I have a great executive coach, and the questions she asks that bring me to new insight are so valuable. And I think it was in the Challenger sale when I was reading that a few years ago. They do focus a lot on the teach, which can be done through asking questions, absolutely, depending on how you approach that section. But I think the way that the authors of that describe it is that you want to run a sales call that people would pay for. And so I think about my own my own experience being coached and just how valuable that is, and hope that all of our sales conversations accomplish the same thing, that we ask great questions and help our clients come to insights about what they need and where the challenge is, such that they would have paid for that early sales conversation.
So here's what you have to do, Shannon.
Yeah.
After your next sales call.
Yes.
Send your prospect an invoice. Let me know how it goes. I'm just kidding.
So good, such that they would pay for it.
That they would pay for it. Wow, that was so good. Well, but it's true. From a mindset perspective, absolutely. That's what that would be the ideal state, right? Is that you've helped them think more broadly, more deeply about what their challenges are and the potential outcomes they can achieve. But that's the value you bring as a seller, right?
That's right.
Is you don't have to, you'll monetize it by getting the win. But that's what they're looking for. It's questions. It's your curiosity that helps them.
That's right.
And yeah, unfortunately, people sort of taken sort of the challenger and said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to prepackage our insights so our sellers have them to be able to, as opposed to making them more organic as they come up through your questions. And
that's right.
I believe the more organic you make them and keep them, and meaning you're in the moment and you're listening to what's happening and responding based on the information you're hearing, those are stronger than, let me pull this challenge out of my backpack. But very interesting. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy.
I'm glad we're able finally to do this after, it's been more than 12 months.
Yeah, maybe. Close to that.
Right before your son was born.
That's right.
Well, I'm glad that everybody's healthy on your side, and I do appreciate you joining me. And so if people want to learn more about Box of Crayons or connect with you, how should they do that?
Yeah, so you can find us at boxofcrayons.com and also connect with us on LinkedIn. We share articles about curiosity and the organizational outcomes it drives. And we share podcasts like this and other cool resources and case studies and work that we're doing with clients to help them unleash the power of curiosity.
Perfect.
And if you want to contact me, I'm Shannon at boxofcrayons.com.
Perfect. All right, Shannon, thank you so much. We'll look forward to doing this again.
Thanks, Andy.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, I'm so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank my guest, Shannon Minifie, for sharing her insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.